The rain was a soft whisper against the window of the quiet cafe. Julia, a freelance journalist, was on her second cup of coffee, the steam warming her face as she reviewed her notes. The details were all there, meticulously gathered over months of relentless work. The corporate corruption, the political cover-up, the money laundering. It was a story that would win awards. She had one last meeting to secure a final, crucial testimony, and then the piece would be published. Her phone buzzed with a message from an anonymous source. "They're on to you, be careful." She smiled, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. She wasn't scared, not with a story this big. A dark sedan pulled up to the curb. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit got out, his face obscured by the twilight. He walked with a chilling sense of purpose, his footsteps making no sound on the wet pavement. Julia looked at the clock, her heart quickening with anticipation. Her source was finally here. The man opened the cafe door, a faint bell jingling, and his eyes, cold and sharp, scanned the room, settling on her. A shiver, colder than the rain, ran down her spine. This wasn't the man she was expecting. He didn't look like a source. He looked like an ending. He approached her table, pulling out a chair without asking. His voice was a low, velvet rumble, devoid of any emotion. "Ms. Evans," he said, and the way he pronounced her name was like a pre-written sentence. "My client extends his regards and a final offer." Julia's defiance wavered. She saw not a man, but a reflection of a vast, unyielding machine of power. He wasn't a threat of violence. He was a promise of absence, a promise that was far more terrifying. That night, Julia Evans vanished. Her coffee cup, still warm, was left on the table. Her notes, the product of months of her life, were gone. The police found no witnesses, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the mundane. Her story, the one that would have exposed a dark web of lies and deceit, was never published. Julia became a statistic, one of many ghosts in the sprawling records of cold cases. They were victims, witnesses, accusers, and they all had one thing in common. They stood in the way of a powerful man. He wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense. There was no bloody trail, no evidence of a struggle. His weapon was the law itself. His name was Arthur Finch, and over a span of 2 decades, he made 17 people disappear. And despite the whispers, despite the growing list of the vanished, he was never, ever charged. Introduction, 300 words. Call to action. Welcome, truth seekers, to a new episode of Your Channel Name, where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature and expose the unsettling truths that hide in plain sight. Today, we're not talking about a simple murder mystery. This is a chilling tale of a predator who didn't need a knife or a gun to eliminate his enemies. He used the very tools designed to protect us, the law. Prepare to enter the world of a man who manipulated justice, not to free the guilty, but to silence the innocent forever. We will explore the shocking true crime story of Arthur Finch, a man who rose to the pinnacle of the legal world, building a reputation for winning the impossible. But behind his charming smile and brilliant legal mind lay a darkness that consumed anyone who threatened his client's secrets. We'll follow the trail of 17 people who vanished without a trace, and the one detective who dedicated his life to proving Finch's guilt, only to be thwarted by the infuriating brilliance of the man he hunted. This is a story of legal loopholes, calculated cruelty, and the terrifying reality that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we empower. If you are a fan of psychological horror and true crime stories that blur the line between justice and its absence, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to our channel to join our community of truth seekers and never miss a new episode. If this chilling tale grabs you from the start, please give us a like, and most importantly, leave a comment letting us know what country and city you're watching from. Your support helps us continue to unearth these unsettling stories. Now let's begin our descent into the darkness. Chapter 1. The First Ghost. Arthur Finch wasn't a man who worked in the shadows. His office, a minimalist masterpiece of glass and steel, sat on the 40th floor, with a sweeping view of the city he had, in many ways, come to own. He was the city's legal prodigy, a man who had never lost a case. His suits were tailored, his movements were precise, and his voice, a low baritone, commanded attention without ever needing to raise it. To his clients, he was a savior. To his adversaries, a force of nature. But to those who knew his true work, he was something else entirely, a ghost maker. His first ghost was a timid, unassuming man named Edward Thorne. A senior accountant at a powerful energy firm, Thorne had spent months meticulously documenting a labyrinth of corporate fraud and illegal dumping. He had evidence, stacks of it, that would send the firm's CEO, a longtime client of Finch, to prison. Thorne had been called to testify, but before he could, the CEO's desperate call came in. "Arthur," the voice on the other end said, dripping with panic, "that accountant, you have to make him go away." Finch's smile was cold and practiced. "Don't worry," he said, "the problem will resolve itself." Finch's first step was not a threat, but a psychological assault. He arranged a meeting with Thorne. His office, with its expansive view and chilling silence, was a tool of intimidation. Finch didn't threaten him. He dismantled him. He spoke in calm, measured legal terms about perjury, about the destruction of evidence, about Thorne's own past tax audits. He planted seeds of doubt, making Thorne question his own motives, his own integrity. Finch looked at him not as a witness, but as a liability, an obstacle to be systematically dismantled. Thorne left the meeting, his hands trembling, the courage that had fueled his months of work evaporating under Finch's gaze. He tried to tell his wife what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. He called a friend, an old colleague, but the line was dead. He felt a creeping paranoia, the sense that an invisible net was closing in around him. He considered going to the press, but a single anonymous text message arrived. "They know where you live. They know where your family is. Drop the story, now." Thorne's brave facade shattered. He was just a man, and he was terrified. The next day, Edward Thorne vanished. He walked out of his office building, a briefcase full of meticulously organized files in his hand. He stepped onto the sidewalk and simply never got to his car. No CCTV footage showed a struggle. No witnesses saw anything unusual. His briefcase, the only proof of his existence as a whistleblower, was gone. The case against the energy firm fell apart. The CEO was free, and Thorne was simply gone, another ghost in the city's vast impersonal files. Detective John Callahan was an anachronism in a world of high-tech policing. A man of quiet persistence and unwavering moral code, he felt a knot of unease with the Thorne case. There was no evidence of a struggle, no blood, no body. But there was a cold, calculated absence that didn't sit right with him. He was a hunter, and he knew in his gut that something had hunted Edward Thorne, and he suspected it was a man, not an accident. His investigation led him inevitably to Arthur Finch's office. The meeting was a masterpiece of legal arrogance. Finch was all charm and polite deflection. "Detective," he said with a warm smile, "I've reviewed the file. A shame, really. I advise my client to settle. But of course, without the key witness, the case is defunct. It happens more than you'd think." He offered Callahan a cup of tea. He provided a perfect alibi. He had been with a client in a different city, a meeting meticulously documented. Callahan saw through the veneer, saw the cold, calculating intelligence behind the polished facade. He knew Finch was guilty, but he couldn't prove a thing. The police investigation stalled. Thorne's family pleaded, but without a body, without a suspect, there was nothing to go on. The case was marked cold. The police moved on. Finch's client, the CEO, went back to his life of luxury. For Finch, it was a victory, another legal hurdle masterfully navigated. He saw the disappearance as a triumph of strategy, an elegant solution to a messy problem. He had removed a piece from the chessboard, and the game was his to win. Finch sat in his office, the city lights twinkling below him like a field of fallen stars. He felt no remorse, no lingering guilt. Edward Thorne was just a name in a file, a footnote in a case that had been resolved to his satisfaction. He wasn't a criminal. He was a lawyer. He worked within the confines of the law. He had simply used his knowledge to its ultimate and terrifying conclusion. Detective Callahan stood outside Thorne's empty apartment, the building silent, the city indifferent. He looked up at the 40th floor office where Arthur Finch sat, a king in his castle. The ghost of Edward Thorne, the first ghost, felt very real to him, and in that moment he knew he had a new case. It wasn't about a missing person anymore. It was about a predator who was untouchable and a detective who was determined to bring him down, one ghost at a time. Chapter 2. The Mother's Ghost. Arthur Finch's life was an exercise in calculated control. His victories were not loud or public. They were quiet demolitions of his opponents, masterclasses in the art of the legal kill. After the Thorne case, a new challenge arrived on his desk. His client, a young, reckless heir to a real estate fortune, was facing a devastating lawsuit. A drunk driving accident had left a young boy severely injured, and his mother, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, was refusing to settle for anything less than a full, public reckoning. Finch saw her not as a grieving mother, but as a dangerous variable, a piece on the board that needed to be neutralized. Sarah Jenkins was a woman of quiet strength, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her son. She wasn't driven by greed. She was driven by a deep, righteous fury. Her son, Danny, lay in a hospital bed, his future uncertain. The settlement offered by Finch's client was a pittance, a cold insult to her son's suffering. She rejected it outright, her voice trembling with emotion, but her resolve unshakable. She wanted justice. She wanted the world to see the carelessness and cruelty of the man who had shattered her son's life. Finch arranged a meeting with Sarah, not to threaten her, but to suffocate her with logic. He sat across from her, his expensive suit a silent rebuke to her faded clothes. He laid out the grim reality of the legal system, the appeals, the delays, the costs. He made her see that by fighting, she wasn't helping her son. She was condemning him to years of uncertainty while his medical bills mounted. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a private settlement, an enormous sum of money that would cover every single one of her son's needs for life. "It's the smart choice, Ms. Jenkins," he said, his voice a dispassionate hum. "Your son needs a mother, not a martyr." Sarah's conscience screamed at her. The money would save her son, but the injustice of it, the thought of this man walking free, was an unbearable weight. She looked into Finch's eyes and saw nothing, not even a flicker of empathy. He was a machine, a function of a system that put profit and power above all else. In that moment, she made her decision. With a trembling hand, she pushed the folder back across the table. "I want justice," she said, her voice a fierce whisper. "My son deserves justice, and so do all the people he's hurt that we don't know about." The next morning, Sarah Jenkins vanished. She was last seen leaving her apartment, heading to the hospital to visit her son. Her car was found in the hospital parking lot, her purse still inside. The police investigation yielded nothing. No witnesses, no signs of foul play. Just a terrible, terrifying, and calculated absence. Her son, a small, frightened boy, was now an orphan, lost in the impersonal machinery of the state. Finch's client was free. The legal system had moved on. The case was dismissed. Detective John Callahan felt a sickening sense of déjà vu, the disappearance of a key figure in a high-profile case. The same modus operandi. No body, no evidence, just a void where a person used to be. He knew with an unshakable certainty that this was Arthur Finch again. He went back to the archives, pulling out the Edward Thorne case, seeing the same chilling pattern emerging. He knew he had to act fast to make sure this ghost wasn't forgotten like the first one. He confronted Finch at his office again, this time without the polite pleasantries. "Where is she, Finch?" Callahan demanded, his voice low and angry. Finch didn't flinch. He leaned back in his leather chair, a portrait of serene confidence. "Detective, I am merely an attorney. Ms. Jenkins's disappearance is a tragedy, but a tragedy is not a crime, and I have a perfect alibi for the time of her disappearance, as you'll soon find out." He offered Callahan a condescending smile. "I'm sure you have a warrant for my arrest, or at least a grand jury subpoena, or are you just here for the conversation?" Callahan felt the walls closing in on him. He had no warrant, no evidence, no witnesses. Finch had once again operated in the shadows, leaving no trace. The prosecutor's office, intimidated by Finch's reputation and his network of powerful contacts, refused to move forward on circumstantial evidence. They saw a brilliant lawyer, a pillar of the community. Callahan saw a monster, but the law, the same law that was supposed to protect the innocent, was protecting the monster. Finch sat in his office after Callahan left, feeling a familiar sense of satisfaction. Sarah Jenkins was just a name in a file, a footnote in a successful legal strategy. He wasn't a criminal, he was a problem solver. He had used the weaknesses of the system to his advantage. He had removed an obstacle, and the outcome of the case was in his client's favor. It was all a game of chess, and he was the undisputed grandmaster. Callahan drove to the hospital to see Danny, a small boy in a big bed. He saw the drawing on the wall, a stick figure of a woman holding a small boy's hand. He felt a rage burn in his chest, a deep, consuming fire of injustice. He knew with a terrible certainty that Arthur Finch wasn't going to stop. He was a machine that ran on money and power, and he had a taste for making people disappear. And Callahan knew, with a gut-wrenching horror, that he was the only one who could stop him. Chapter 3. The Rival's Ghost. Arthur Finch's life was built on a foundation of control, but that foundation had a new and unexpected crack. Her name was Eleanor Vance, a young, brilliant attorney who was making a name for herself by systematically dismantling the very laws Finch had helped to construct. She wasn't a whistleblower or a grieving mother. She was a rival. She was smart, ambitious, and she was getting dangerously close to exposing a series of legal loopholes Finch had meticulously embedded in key legislation. Her public challenges were not just a professional annoyance, they were a direct threat to his legacy and his untouchable status. Eleanor was a different kind of adversary for Finch. She wasn't intimidated by his reputation. She saw him not as a god of the legal world, but as a dinosaur. She was public in her contempt, speaking at conferences and writing scathing articles that hinted at a deeper, more sinister pattern in Finch's work. She was fearless, and she was getting close to a truth that would expose the underbelly of Finch's firm, a hidden network of associates and shell corporations that executed his problems. Finch's reaction was not one of his usual cold, calculated demolitions. This was personal. He saw in Eleanor a reflection of his younger, more ambitious self, but without the moral compromise. He couldn't afford to let her win. He had his network of private investigators dig into her life, looking for weaknesses, for a scandal that would ruin her. But Eleanor was clean. She was too smart, too careful. Finch realized he couldn't beat her in a public court. He had to remove her from the game entirely. The disappearance of Eleanor Vance was not a quiet affair. It happened in broad daylight, in the heart of the city, but with a chilling, calculated confusion. She was last seen leaving a high-profile legal conference, getting into a black town car. The driver's face was not visible on any of the security cameras. The car was found a week later, abandoned in an airport parking lot in a neighboring state, with no trace of her or any evidence of a struggle. The case was a national scandal, a front-page story that baffled the police and sent a shiver of fear through the legal community. Detective Callahan felt a cold, simmering rage when he heard the news. He saw the pattern. The target wasn't a witness or a victim this time. It was a rival, a direct challenge to Finch's power. Callahan tried to connect the three cases, but the lack of a common thread was infuriating. Thorne was a whistleblower, Jenkins a grieving mother, Vance a brilliant lawyer. The only thing they had in common was the man who had made them disappear. Callahan felt like he was shouting into a void, a single voice against a system designed to protect a monster. He confronted Finch with a prosecutor at his side. The atmosphere in Finch's office was different this time. Finch wasn't a charming host. He was a cold, professional wall of defiance. "This is a gross misuse of your office, detective," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Ms. Vance was a rival. "I'm a high-profile attorney with many rivals. The list of people who would want her gone is long. To accuse me without a shred of evidence is slander." The prosecutor, intimidated by Finch's cold confidence, backed down. Finch had once again used the law as his shield, deflecting all accusations with the precision of a surgeon. Callahan later discovered the legal loopholes that protected Finch. He learned that Finch had a network of fixers, private contractors who operated under the legal cover of an anonymous shell corporation. These contractors handled the disappearances, but they had no direct contact with Finch. They were paid by the corporation, which was legally separated from Finch's firm. It was a perfect system. Finch never had to get his hands dirty, and the chain of evidence was broken at every single link. He had found a way to commit murder without ever being a suspect. The deeper Callahan dug, the more he realized the true horror of Finch's operation. He wasn't just a lone sociopath, he was the center of a spider's web of professional, respectable people. The private investigators who followed Eleanor Vance, the drivers who drove the town car, the people who handled the shell corporations, they were all professionals who had a perfect legal excuse for what they were doing. They were all cogs in a machine of evil, a machine with Finch at its center. Finch's inner monologue was not one of a man who felt guilt or regret. He saw himself as a necessary force, a social engineer. The world, in his view, was a chaotic mess, and he was simply a force of order, a surgeon who removed the cancerous growths that threatened the system. Thorne, Jenkins, Vance, they were not people. They were problems, and he was the only one who had the courage to solve them. He was a god in his own twisted world. The case of Eleanor Vance went cold. The police had no leads, no evidence. The prosecutor's office officially closed the case. Finch, meanwhile, was celebrating a major legal victory, a new contract with a powerful lobbyist firm. He was more powerful than ever. Detective Callahan, however, was at a national conference on missing persons. He looked at Eleanor's face on a poster, her bright, ambitious eyes staring back at him, and he realized with a terrifying clarity that Finch wasn't just a murderer. He was the system, and the system had just declared him untouchable. Chapter 4. The Suicide's Ghost. Arthur Finch was a man who learned from his mistakes. The public nature of Eleanor Vance's disappearance was a flaw in his design, a crack in his perfectly constructed world. He needed to be more careful, more subtle. His next problem was a young, idealistic associate from his own firm, Ben Carter. Ben, in a moment of naive curiosity, had stumbled upon a document, a ledger detailing payments from a seemingly benign consulting firm to a network of private contractors. The consulting firm was a shell company. The contractors were Finch's fixers. Ben, a timid, frightened young man, now held the smoking gun. Ben was no hero. He wasn't a crusader for justice. He was just a young man who had seen something he shouldn't have. He tried to get the document to a reporter, but the reporter, having seen the stories about Julia Evans and Eleanor Vance, backed down. The reporter's fear was a cold, hard fact. Ben was alone. He felt a creeping dread, the sense that he was a marked man. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, a cage of fear and complicity. Finch's reaction was not one of his usual cold, calculated demolitions. This was personal. He saw in Ben not an adversary, but a betrayal. He decided to send a message. Ben's disappearance was orchestrated to look like a suicide. His apartment, a small, cluttered box of books and papers, was left in a state of carefully curated disarray. A laptop was found with a hastily typed suicide note. The note was filled with vague apologies, the desperate words of a man who had lost his way. The message was clear. Anyone who tried to expose Finch would not just disappear, they would be erased, and their honor would be taken with them. Detective Callahan, however, had a new ally. A frightened reporter who had seen Ben's terror called him with an anonymous tip. The tip led Callahan to a coffee shop where Ben had left a coded message. It was a single, crumpled napkin with a series of names and numbers. To a layman, it was gibberish. But to Callahan, it was a map. He cross-referenced the names and numbers with Finch's firm and found a match. He had found a paper trail, a document that to a trained eye revealed the existence of the shell corporation that funded Finch's fixers. This was the first real piece of evidence, a crack in Finch's armor. Callahan confronted Finch with the document. The atmosphere in Finch's office was electric with tension. Finch was no longer charming and polite. He was a predator, cornered. He looked at the document, his eyes cold and dangerous. He dismissed it as a forgery, as a desperate attempt by a mentally unstable young man to frame him. "This is slander, detective," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You have no proof. You have a napkin. I have a firm of lawyers who will bury you in paperwork until you wish you'd never been born." The prosecutor, emboldened by the new evidence, agreed to a grand jury hearing. This was Callahan's moment, his chance to finally expose Finch. The grand jury room was a solemn, intimidating place. Finch sat at the head of the table, his demeanor a portrait of serene confidence. Callahan laid out his case, the disappearances, the document, the suicide note. He spoke with a quiet passion, his voice filled with the rage of a man who had seen too much. But Finch was a master of his craft. He dismantled Callahan's case with the precision of a surgeon. He tore apart the document, proving it was a flimsy piece of evidence with no legal standing. He brought in a psychologist who testified that Ben Carter was a man with a history of mental health issues, a man who was prone to making up stories. He made Callahan look like an obsessed, desperate detective with a vendetta. The grand jury, intimidated and confused, refused to indict. The case was dismissed. The document was declared inadmissible. Ben Carter's disappearance was officially ruled a suicide. The horror was not in the outcome, but in the process. Finch had not just won, he had won using the very system that was supposed to bring him to justice. He had proven that he was truly untouchable, that the law was his greatest weapon, and that no amount of evidence could ever touch him. Finch sat in his office after the grand jury, the city lights twinkling below him. He was not celebrating. He was angry. The grand jury was a personal insult, a sign that Callahan was getting too close. He saw the detective not as an adversary, but as a pest, an insect that needed to be exterminated. He decided to send a message that would finally put an end to Callahan's investigation. Detective Callahan stood outside Ben Carter's apartment, the sun setting on another day of injustice. The headline read, "Lawyer cleared." He knew he had lost the legal battle, but the war was not over. He looked at the window of Finch's office, a small light in the darkness. He knew he had to find another way to bring Finch down, even if it meant stepping outside the law. And in that moment, he realized with a terrifying clarity that he was now alone. A single voice against a system of evil, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. Chapter 5. The Fixer's Ghost. Detective John Callahan was a man on the edge of a precipice. The grand jury's verdict, no indictment, was a bullet in his gut. His colleagues, once supportive, now saw him as an obsessed, reckless pariah. The prosecutor's office, eager to move on from the embarrassment, had closed the case. Callahan was a ghost in his own precinct, a hunter with no license, a detective with no case. He was alone, and the knowledge of Finch's untouchable evil was a suffocating weight that threatened to crush him. A call came in from a burner phone, the kind of call that only comes when someone is truly desperate. The voice on the other end, a low, frantic whisper, belonged to a man named Mark. He was one of Finch's fixers, a cog in the machine that made people disappear. Mark, a former Black Ops soldier, had always believed he was just a paid contractor, a professional. But after the suicide of Ben Carter, the reality of his work had finally hit him. He was a murderer, and he knew that Finch, who saw him as just another liability, would eventually come for him. They met in a dark, empty warehouse on the city's industrial waterfront. Mark was a shadow in the darkness, a man whose face was a mask of terror and exhaustion. He told Callahan the story of Finch's operation, the cold, calculated disappearances, the anonymous shell corporations, the legal loopholes. He wasn't a hero, but a man who had seen too much and was now trying to save his own life. He described Finch not as a man, but as a void, a black hole of morality and empathy. He doesn't hate people, Mark whispered, his voice trembling. He doesn't even see them as people. They're just problems, and he's a problem solver. Mark gave Callahan a clue, not a document, but a location. There's a place, he said, his voice a strained whisper. An old farmhouse, a couple of hours north of the city. That's where we took some of them. It was a holding place before they were gone for good. This was it. This was the first real, tangible lead. Callahan felt a cold, simmering rage. This was not a legal game. This was a place where people were held, where their lives were ended. This was a truth that could not be dismissed in a courtroom. Callahan was now faced with a terrible moral compromise. He had to take a tip from a criminal, a man who was complicit in the murders. He had to go to a location without a warrant, without official authorization. He had to step outside the law to get justice. He knew this was a dangerous game, a game that could get him fired, or worse, killed. But the ghosts of Thorne, Jenkins, and Vance were a chorus in his mind, and their silence was a call to action. He and a small, trusted team of detectives, men who had seen his pain and believed in his cause, went to the farmhouse. The scene was a somber, terrifying testament to Finch's cruelty. The farmhouse, abandoned and crumbling, was a museum of human despair. They found evidence of the disappearances, personal effects, a half-eaten meal on a rusted table, a child's drawing on a wall, a single, lonely shoe. The horror was not in the brutality, but in the mundane nature of the evidence, the signs of lives that were simply stopped. Callahan now had physical evidence. He had a location. He had the testimony of a confessed killer. He had a case. But when he went to the judge for a warrant for Finch's arrest, he was met with a stone wall. The judge, a longtime friend of Finch's, dismissed the evidence as circumstantial, the testimony as hearsay from a known criminal. The legal system, once again, worked to protect him. The horror was not in the crime, but in the realization that the system was not just flawed, it was corrupt. In a final act of desperation, Callahan went to a respected journalist with his evidence. The journalist, a young and ambitious man, was a perfect match for Callahan's obsession. But when the story was published, Finch's lawyers immediately filed a lawsuit, threatening to sue the journalist, the paper, and Callahan himself into bankruptcy. The paper, terrified of the legal costs, pulled the story, and the journalist was fired. Finch had once again used the law to silence the truth. Finch, now knowing that Callahan was getting close, decided to send a message, not to Callahan, but to his family. A package arrived at Callahan's home. Inside, there were no threats, no violent images. There were just photos of his wife smiling at a farmer's market, photos of his daughter playing on a swing set in a park. The photos were taken with a telephoto lens from a great distance. They were a silent, terrifying promise of a fate that could befall his family. The chapter concludes with Callahan, his face a mask of terror and rage, holding the photos in his hands. He knew that Finch was no longer playing a legal game. He was in a war, and the stakes were the lives of his family. The horror was no longer abstract, it was personal and immediate. He had gone to the dark side to get justice, and now the darkness had come for him. And in that moment, he realized with a terrifying clarity that he had to go to war, a war that he knew he could not win. Chapter 6. The Hunter's Ghost. The package with the photos of his wife and daughter was a turning point for Detective John Callahan. The legal battle was over. The game of cat and mouse had become a war. He was no longer a detective seeking justice, he was a father seeking protection. The terror that had been abstract and professional was now personal and visceral. The man who had made 17 people disappear was now a threat to his family. And Callahan knew he had to act, not as a cop, but as a man with nothing left to lose. The next morning, with a heavy heart, he sent his wife and daughter away. He lied to them, telling them it was an impromptu vacation, a chance to get away from the stress of his last case. But the truth was a cold weight in his stomach. He was sending them away to protect them, a move that he knew was a final, desperate act of a man who was losing his grip on his world. He watched their car disappear down the street, feeling a sense of dread and an aching loneliness. He was now alone, a lone soldier in a war that he knew he couldn't win. Callahan's next move was a violation of every police procedure he had ever learned. He went off the books, using his old-school police instincts to track the one man who could help him, Mark, the fixer. Mark was a ghost, a man who had vanished from the face of the earth, living in fear of the monster he had helped create. Callahan used his old contacts, his street-smart intuition, and his obsessive persistence to track a man who didn't want to be found. He found Mark in a remote, squalid motel on the outskirts of the city. The man was a broken shell of his former self, his eyes filled with a terror that was palpable. He was a ghost in his own life, a man who was waiting for the end. Callahan didn't offer him a deal. He offered him a chance at redemption. He convinced Mark to work with him, to help him bring Finch down, not for the law, but for a moral absolution. "You helped him make them disappear," Callahan said, his voice low and firm. "Now you can help me find him. You can make things right." Callahan and Mark devised a plan, a desperate high-risk trap that would expose Finch's network and his crimes. They would use a fake whistleblower, a former criminal with nothing to lose, to bait Finch. This person would pretend to have a document that could bring Finch down. The plan was simple, and it was the only one they had. It was a game of cat and mouse, with Finch as the ultimate predator. The setup was a terrifying, silent symphony of suspense. They arranged for the fake whistleblower to meet with a decoy. The location was a crowded city park, a place where Finch's fixers would have to operate in the open. Callahan and his team were in place, waiting for Finch's men to make their move. The horror was in the waiting, the silent, tense moments where everything could go wrong. The sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows on the park. But Finch was always one step ahead. He had a network of informers, and he had a brilliant, calculating mind. The fixers didn't come for the fake whistleblower. They came for Mark, the traitor. The message was clear. Anyone who betrayed Finch would not be forgiven. The trap had failed, and a new victim was about to be claimed. Callahan watched in horror as a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Two men, cold and professional, got out and grabbed Mark. The man didn't even scream. He was a man who had been expecting this for a long time. The chase was on, but Callahan knew he was outmatched and outgunned. He had lost his only leverage, and the man who had given him his last hope was about to become another ghost. Callahan's car careened through the city streets, a desperate high-speed chase that was doomed from the start. He was a single man against a network of professionals. The black sedan disappeared into the night, and Callahan was left alone, a solitary figure in a city that was indifferent to his pain. He had failed. He had lost his only chance to bring Finch down, and in that moment he felt a crushing sense of defeat, a despair that was more terrifying than any threat. The chapter concludes with Callahan, his face a mask of rage and despair, sitting alone in his car, the city lights twinkling below him. He had gone to the dark side to get justice, and now the darkness had come for him. He had lost his ally, his case, and his hope, but he had not lost his rage. The war was not over. It was just getting started. He knew he had to find another way to bring Finch down, even if it meant stepping outside the law again. The horror was in the realization that he was now alone, a single voice against a system of evil, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. Chapter 7. The Anonymous Ghost. Detective John Callahan was a man adrift in a sea of despair. He had lost his ally, his only tangible lead, and his hope was a flickering ember in the storm of his rage. He felt the weight of his failure in every moment, the ghosts of the missing a silent chorus in his mind. He was a professional pariah, a man whose career was a footnote in the history of a monster. He was on the verge of giving up, of retreating into the silence and trying to live a normal life with his family. But the darkness, once a threat, had become his home, and he knew he could not leave it. His isolation was a cold, constant companion. He was an officer without a case, a hunter without a license. His colleagues, once supportive, now avoided him, their silence a rebuke. He spent his days in the archives, poring over old files, searching for a ghost of a lead. He felt like a madman, a single voice shouting into a void. The prosecutor's office had washed its hands of him. The legal system had declared Finch innocent, and the world had moved on. He was a man with a righteous fury and no way to express it. The phone call came in the dead of night. A private number, a voice cloaked in a digital disguise. The man on the other end was a ghost, a voice of terror and despair. He was a former associate of Finch, a man who had been a cog in the machine that made people disappear. He had seen what happened to Mark, the fixer, and he was terrified. "He's coming for me," the voice whispered, a tremor of pure fear in every word. "He knows I know too much. He'll make me disappear." The source gave Callahan a new, more concrete clue. Not a document, but a pattern. The disappearances were not random. They were connected to a specific legal loophole that Finch used to make them untraceable. He had found a way to use the law to make people vanish. He had created a legal black hole, a place where the law could not reach, and he was using it to commit murder. This was the key, the puzzle piece that Callahan had been missing. The source, now more desperate, agreed to meet Callahan. He was a coward, a man who had helped a monster, but he was a crucial piece of the puzzle. He gave Callahan a name and a location, a man who could help him, a man who knew all about Finch's operations, a former associate who had a personal vendetta against Finch. This man was the only person who could help Callahan navigate the darkness of Finch's world. Callahan met with the man, a former fixer who had a personal grudge against Finch. This man was a professional, a man who knew the dark underbelly of Finch's world. He was a new kind of ally for Callahan, a man who knew how to fight on Finch's terms. He was not a hero. He was a man who had seen too much and now wanted a revenge that the law could not provide. He was a new kind of weapon for Callahan, a man who could fight a monster with the monster's own tools. The new plan was not about the legal system. It was about a non-legal solution. It was about a plan to expose Finch in a way that the legal system could not ignore. It was about a public spectacle, a way to make Finch's crimes so visible that the system would be forced to react. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and it involved a moral compromise that Callahan was not comfortable with. The plan was a lie, a deception, a moral ambiguity that went against everything Callahan had ever believed in. They would use a fake witness, a man who would testify to a crime that Finch's client had committed. Finch, in his cold, calculating way, would make him disappear. But the witness would not be a real person. He would be a man who had been set up, a man who would be found in a safe house with a confession and a witness who would testify to his abduction. The personal cost of this new plan was high. Callahan knew that if he failed, he would not only be a professional failure, but he would also be putting himself and his family in even greater danger. He would be a man who had crossed a line, a man who had broken his oath. He was a man who had to go into the darkness to fight a monster, and he knew that he might not come back. The chapter concludes with Callahan, his face a mask of determination, making a final, desperate choice. He is no longer fighting for justice. He is fighting for his life and the lives of the people he loves. He is a lone wolf, a man who has to go into the darkness to fight a monster, and he knows that he might not come back. The horror is in the moral compromise, the realization that to fight a monster, he has to become one. Chapter 8. The legal phantom detective John Callahan was a man on a warpath, and he had a new weapon: deceit. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and it involved a moral compromise that went against every fiber of his being. He and his new allies, a former associate of Finch and a fake witness, set up the trap. The witness, a man named Leo, was a ghost in his own life, a man who had nothing to lose and a deep-seated hatred for the system that had failed him. He was the perfect bait for a monster who preyed on the vulnerable. The bait was a story, a fabrication of corporate fraud and blackmail that was just plausible enough to get Finch's attention. Leo, the fake whistleblower, leaked the story to a small, independent newspaper, a paper that was too small to be intimidated by Finch's lawyers. The story was published, and the public was captivated. Finch, seeing the story, took the bait. He saw Leo not as a real person, but as a problem to be solved. He saw the story not as a threat to his reputation, but as a threat to his clients. The waiting was a terrifying and tense affair. Callahan, his allies, and his trusted team of detectives were in place, waiting for Finch's fixers to make their move. The horror was in the silence, the waiting for the shoe to drop. The sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows on the city. The tension was palpable, a silent symphony of suspense that was punctuated only by the sound of their own breathing. They were waiting for a monster to make a move, a monster that they knew was a master of his craft. Finch's fixers, a team of professional and cold-blooded men, abducted Leo. The abduction was a moment of pure, terrifying suspense. It was not a violent struggle. It was a methodical, chilling act that showed the professionalism of Finch's network. The fixers, in a black sedan, grabbed Leo, put a bag over his head, and drove away. The abduction was so quick, so precise, that it was a testament to the fact that they had done this before, and they had done it with a chilling efficiency. The fixers took Leo to the same abandoned farmhouse that the former fixer had told Callahan about. Callahan and his team were in place. They had a witness, a camera, and a confession. The trap was sprung. They moved in, their hearts pounding in their chests. They arrested the fixers and they rescued Leo. The fixers, cold and professional, didn't say a word. They were a testament to the fact that Finch had created a network of professionals who were loyal to him, not to a cause. The fixers were arrested, but they were cold and professional. They didn't give up Finch. They had been trained to deal with this, and they had no connection to Finch that could be proven in court. They were just men who had been hired to do a job that they had done with a chilling efficiency. They had no idea who Finch was, and they had no idea that they had been set up. They were just cogs in a machine that had been created to make people disappear. Finch, now knowing that he had been set up, made a countermove. He used his legal brilliance to discredit the confession, the witness, and the abduction itself. He claimed it was a setup, a desperate act by a disgraced detective who was obsessed with him. He claimed that Leo was a criminal who had a history of lying, and that the police had used him to entrap a man who was a pillar of the community. The legal system, once again, was on his side. The media, now a key player, was a double-edged sword. They published the story of the abduction, but but they also published Finch's counter-move. The public was divided. The story was now a spectacle, a media circus, and not a search for justice. The public was confused, and they didn't know who to believe. The story was no longer about a man who made people disappear. It was about a man who was being persecuted by a corrupt detective. The moral compromise that Callahan made now came back to haunt him. He had to deal with the fact that he used a lie, a deception, to get justice. He had become a man who had to justify his actions, a man who had to live with the fact that he had become a man who had to lie to get justice. He was a man who had to live with the fact that he had become a man who had to lie to get justice. The chapter concludes with Callahan, exhausted and defeated, looking at the news. The fixers are in jail, but Finch is free. The legal system has failed again. The horror is not in the crime, but in the realization that Finch is truly untouchable, a man who can use the law to commit murder and get away with it. The moral compromise that Callahan made has now come to a terrible price. The war for now is over, but the ghost of the missing and the ghost of his own soul will haunt him forever. Chapter 9. The Sun's Ghost. Detective John Callahan was a man defeated. The legal battle was over, the fixers were in jail, but the monster Arthur Finch was free. He was a professional pariah, a man whose career was a footnote in the history of a monster. He was on the verge of giving up, of retreating into the silence and trying to live a normal life with his family. But the ghosts of the missing were a constant, heavy presence, a silent chorus in his mind that would not let him rest. The public, once captivated by the story, had moved on. The media circus had died down, and Finch was back to his old life, untouchable and powerful. The horror was in the public's short memory and the easy way they forgot the truth. The disappearances, once a national scandal, were now just a rumor, a whisper in the dark. The city had moved on, but Callahan was still haunted by the ghosts of the missing. He received a cryptic message that led him to a final meeting with a man who had a grudge against Finch. This man was not a hero, but a broken, bitter man who had nothing to lose. He was a former associate of Finch, a man who had been used and discarded. He was the key to Finch's final downfall. He was a man who knew a secret that Finch had been hiding for years. The man gave Callahan a new, more concrete clue, not a document, but a personal story, a secret that Finch had been hiding for years. This secret was a weakness, a chink in his armor that Callahan could exploit. Finch, the master of control, had a secret that he had been hiding from the world. He had a son that he had kept hidden from the world. The son was not a part of Finch's world of law and power. He was a normal, kind-hearted person who had no idea of his father's true nature. The new plan was not about the law, it was about a non-legal solution. It was about a public confrontation, a way to make Finch's crime so personal that he could not hide behind the law. The plan was to expose Finch's secret to the world. It was a plan to use an innocent person, Finch's son, to get to the monster. This was a difficult, morally ambiguous choice that Callahan had to make. The confrontation was a moment of pure, terrifying suspense. Callahan confronted Finch with the truth. Finch, for the first time, was not a lawyer. He was a father. His cold, professional demeanor cracked, and he was a man who was terrified of losing his son. He was a man who had lost everything, but he had a son that he had kept hidden from the world, a son that he had loved more than his own life. The son, a young man named Michael, was a normal person. He worked in a small art gallery, and he had a passion for painting. He was a kind-hearted person who had no idea of his father's true nature. He loved his father, a man who he believed was a good man, a man who was a pillar of the community. But the truth, when it came out, was a bullet in his heart. Finch, in a moment of desperation, made a final, terrible choice. He tried to protect his son from the truth, but it's too late. The son found out about his father's true nature, and he was a man who was broken by the truth. He was a man who had to live with the fact that his father, the man he loved, was a monster. He was a man who had to live with the fact that his father, the man he loved, had made 17 people disappear. The chapter concludes with Finch, a man who has lost everything, a man who has been exposed to the world, a man who has lost the one person he truly loved. He's a man who has lost his son, his reputation and his power. The horror is not in the crime, but in the realization that the man who made 17 people disappear is now a man who is all alone. The chapter concludes with Finch, a man who has lost everything, a man who has been exposed to the world, a man who has lost the one person he truly loved. He is a man who has lost his son, his reputation, and his power. The horror is not in the crime, but in the realization that the man who made 17 people disappear is now a man who is all alone. Chapter 10. The Unraveling. The world of Arthur Finch unraveled not with a bang, but with a whisper. The public exposure of his son and his secrets had been the crack in his perfect facade. The public outrage that followed was a storm, and the legal system, once his shield, was now forced to turn on him. He was no longer the untouchable lawyer, he was a pariah. His clients, sensing the coming disaster, had left him. His reputation was in tatters, and he was a man who had lost everything. The man who had used the law to his advantage was now a man who was at the mercy of the law. The legal system, now forced to act, reopened the cases of the missing. The evidence that was once dismissed as hearsay was now being re-evaluated. The police, no longer afraid of Finch's power, were now looking for a new lead. The former associates, now seeing their former master fall, were coming forward, telling the stories of the disappearances, the cold, calculated murders. The man who had used the law to his advantage was now a man who was a prisoner of the law. Callahan had a final meeting with the broken, bitter man who had given him the secret. This man, a former associate of Finch's, was a man who was now a hero, a man who had helped bring a monster down. He was a man who had found a new purpose in his life, a new way to live with his past. He had a new life, a new identity, and a new sense of peace. He had found a way to atone for his sins, a way to live with the ghosts of the missing. Callahan had a final, crucial meeting with Finch. This time, Finch was not in his office. He was in a jail cell. The meeting was a somber, silent affair. Finch was a broken man, a man who had lost everything. He was no longer a monster, but a man who was all alone. He was a man who had used the law to his advantage, and now he was a man who was a prisoner of the law. Finch, in his final moments of despair, told Callahan the truth. He confessed to all the disappearances, the cold, calculated murders. He told Callahan about the moral compromises, the legal loopholes, and the network of professionals who helped him. The truth, when it came out, was more horrifying than Callahan had ever imagined. The man who had used the law to his advantage was now a man who was a prisoner of the truth. Finch's son, Michael, was a man who was broken by the truth. He was a man who had to live with the fact that his father, the man he loved, was a monster. He was a man who had to find a new way to live, a new way to live with the fact that his father was a man who made 17 people disappear. He had lost his father, and he had lost his innocence. Finch was convicted of the murders. The man who was once the most powerful lawyer in the city is now a prisoner, a man who is all alone. The horror of the story is not in the crime, but in the realization that the man who made 17 people disappear is now a man who has been erased from the world. He had used the law to erase others, and now the law had erased him. Callahan, a man who has risked everything, is now a hero. He has brought a monster down, but he is a man who has to live with the moral compromises he made. He is a man who has to live with the fact that he used a lie, a deception to get justice. He is a man who has to live with the fact that he has become a man who has to lie to get justice. Callahan had a final moment with his family. He had brought a monster down, but the real victory is in the fact that he has brought his family back together. He is a man who has risked everything for justice, and he has come back a hero. He had found a way to live with the ghosts of the missing, a way to live with the fact that he had become a man who had to lie to get justice. Callahan, a man who has risked everything, is now a hero. He has brought a monster down, but he is a man who has to live with the moral compromises he made. He is a man who has to live with the fact that he used a lie, a deception, to get justice. He is a man who has to live with the fact that he has become a man who has to lie to get justice. And so, the story of Arthur Finch, the man who made 17 people disappear, ends not with a murder, but with a legal reckoning. It's a somber tale that reminds us that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who hide in the shadows, but the ones who operate in plain sight, protected by the very system they are sworn to uphold. The horror of his story is not in the brutality of his crimes, but in the cold, calculated way he used the law as a weapon, a shield, and a final terrible act of erasure. The story of Detective Callahan, a man who risked everything, is a testament to the fact that justice sometimes requires a moral compromise. He had to become a man who had to lie to get justice, a man who had to step outside the law to fight a monster. His story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important battles are not fought in a courtroom, but in the darkest corners of the human soul. If this terrifying story of a man who used the law to commit murder has captivated you, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us to continue to bring you these stories of true crime and psychological horror. And most importantly, leave a comment below telling us what country and city you are watching from. We'll see you in the next one.